Today, I'm going to teach you how to cut your render times in half. Well, maybe terms and conditions apply, and depending on the machine you're using and the machine you're connecting to. Hey, Alec Mill here, founder of Rolls & Rogues, and today I want to give you a comprehensive walkthrough of setting up a team renderer for Cinema 4D. I'm going to kind of be alternating between creative short film videos and tutorials. And if you haven't checked out our short film videos, I highly recommend it. It's an exciting project we're working on, and I'm breaking down every single step of the way, so I think you're really going to enjoy it. I was able to double my render speeds or cut my render times in half by using Team Renderer in Cinema 4D. So Maxon hasn't exactly been great about updating their documentation, especially for videos of Team Renderer. And I've seen a lot of misconceptions around it, as well as perhaps even people that think they're not getting a speed increase that are. So stick around as I explain kind of all of this. So what Team Renderer does is allow you to use any machine on your network to add to your render power. So if you have another computer sitting around that's connected to your local area network, what you can do is use Team Renderer to hook it up and speed up your renders. Sounds great. Why wouldn't anyone use this? This is amazing. Let's just connect all of my computers I have, my dad's computer, my mom's computer, my little cousin's computer. Hold up there, bucko. Not so fast. There's a bit of fine print when it comes to Team Renderer that I'm going to have to warn against before I walk you through every step of setup. And that is that it's not exactly the best way to do everything. So I'm kind of the ideal user. I have a secondary machine that's just doing nothing all the time that I would really love to rope in to my render network. The other people I would recommend using this is someone that has a new MacBook Pro or a really powerful mobile GPU that's sort of sitting around while you're using your desktop, not really getting any use. Now, there's a few people that I don't think should really use Team Renderer. And that's if you have a PC right now or you're doing your first build or a new build for 3D rendering, it's actually far better to kind of build one machine with all the power in that. So rather than thinking, well, I could buy a whole bunch of GPUs and a bunch of motherboards and build like this network of rendering, that's not actually how Redshift and other renderers like to be used. Redshift in particular can take advantage of up to 8 GPUs on one machine, meaning that you don't really need all this networking and extra steps just to get a lot faster renders. My second reason for saying this is because in order to render Redshift on another GPU, another machine, you're going to have to buy a second license or a render node. And what that means is you're going to be paying monthly for the privilege to render on a second machine. And if you're paying month to month, that's $40 a month. And over the course of a year or so, you could probably end up buying a GPU for that price. So like I said, if you already have some power just lying around not getting used, this is for you. So now that I've kind of told you whether or not you should actually use Team Renderer, let's get into setting it up. First off, what you're going to need is a second license if you're rendering on a GPU. Now, here's a cool loophole that I haven't tested myself because I don't have one, but should work, which is if you're rendering to the CPU, you don't actually need a second license. I think you're allowed up to like 4 machines or something like that if you're rendering to only the CPU, which is really cool because it means you can test this setup before actually having to commit to buying a license. The other cool loophole with this is if you have an ARM processor, it's technically a CPU. So you shouldn't really need to get a second license if you're rendering to one of the newer MacBooks, which is awesome. That sounds like one of the best bangs for your buck, frankly, is if you have a MacBook and a workstation, you might be able to get a little bit of extra render oomph by just connecting it quick and easy. And by the way, when I say second license, you just need a Redshift license. You don't have to buy an entire secondary Maxon One account. It was a little confusing when I was talking to tech support about this, whether or not that's what I would need to do, but you only need to buy a Redshift license. The other thing you're going to need is an Ethernet cable, and preferably a 10 gigabit Ethernet cable, and you're going to need to connect both computers to the same network. What this is going to look like for most people is simply connecting both machines to your router, not to each other, but to your router using Ethernet cables. So now that you have a second license, another machine hooked up through Ethernet to a local area network, let's get started. First thing you want to do is open up your Maxon app. This is how you install Cinema 4D, Redshift, and all of your plugins. You're going to want to make sure everything is installed and updated, or at least all on the same versions on both machines. Now, something that I didn't understand when I first started doing this is that you can actually install Cinema 4D on multiple machines from one account without needing to assign a license to each machine. So what you can do is you go to your Cinema 4D, you're going to click install, but then here where you have your licenses, you don't actually have to have the Cinema 4D license assigned to each machine. Ignore this Team Render server for now. That's another way of managing this. This is if you're managing a lot of machines in different locations and then have a third machine that's managing those other machines. That's going to be your server, but we're going to ignore that for now. All of your plugins, you're also going to want to have installed and updated to the same version on both machines. Finally, you're going to take your render engine and you're going to make sure that that has a license assigned to it that isn't your main license. So your secondary license is going to be installed on that secondary machine. So now you have Cinema 4D, Redshift, and all of your plugins installed the same version on both machines. That's key. Now that you have that done, let's look at Team Render itself. So on your main machine where you're going to be working and setting up your render and lights and everything, you're going to want to go to Renderer, and then you want to go to Team Render Machines. And this is going to list all the machines on your network. As you can see, I have the second machine that's currently offline, and you can add machines from here. So this is where you're going to add machines and control things. The other thing you want to do is go to Preferences, and then under Preferences, you're going to go to Renderer, and you're going to go to Team Render. And here, this is where all the valuable information is. So I'll really quickly walk you through this. But these are the two main windows you need to be concerned about. Computer name is simply this, the name of your PC. You can rename it. I would leave it the same. Next, you have your security token, which can either be a random set of numbers and letters, or you can change it to be just whatever you want, 111, 1234, 5, whatever you need. And the port, and this is where it's going to communicate with your other machine. You have to have announced service to local network and or announced service to Bonjour checked. This is how your other machines can see each other. You also need to have share machine to network checked. All these should pretty much always be on. Bonjour is typically what Mac uses, and just your local network is what you're going to use on PC. You can have Bonjour installed on PC, but don't really worry about it too much. You just need all these checked so they can communicate. Your custom render threads, you can typically leave unchecked. What this is going to do is just use as many threads as available on both computers' CPUs. So it's going to use up all the resources it possibly can. If for some reason you want to do another task while rendering, you can check this and limit your machine to X number of threads, so that way you keep a few so you can answer emails or something. I would typically just leave my machine running. It's a bad idea to really run a lot of different programs while also trying to render. The likelihood of you causing a crash or slowing something down is high. If there's an emergency and you have to do two things at once, I guess you can, but I think the ideal way to do this would be use all the resources on both machines and then use your phone or something to get a little bit of extra work done, writing or sending emails. So the rest of these settings are more technical, but we'll go through them anyway. Abort render on client error is exactly what it sounds. If there's an error, it stops the render. Always fetch assets from the server. This doesn't really matter unless you're using Team Server, and you're going to want to leave this unchecked because you're going to be using peer-to-peer asset distribution, which I'll get to in a second. Rendering timeout seconds. This means if it's not getting any information back from a node after so many seconds, it's just going to stop that render. Exclude client on out of memory, meaning that if a client runs out of memory, it's going to just shut off the, it's not going to use that client if there's too much memory needed to render a scene. Encrypt is exactly what it sounds like. It encrypts the connections. It doesn't really help that much. If you're on an unsecured network, this might be a good idea, but I wouldn't render on an unsecured network. And even so, there's still going to be decrypted files on either end, so on either machine. So you're really not that safe. I just leave it unchecked. Client gets assets on demand. You're going to want this checked. What this means is if you have a large, let's say, image sequence driving a texture, as I render each frame, I get each part of that texture, that animated texture, each frame of it, as opposed to needing to load the entire animated texture in and then render all the frames. It's faster to call these things one by one. Handle warnings as errors. It just essentially treats a warning as something more than a warning. Exclude client on loading error. Just again, if one of your PCs has an error, just kicks it out of rendering. And then peer-to-peer asset distribution is, like I said, the same thing as get assets on demand. This is going to override most of that stuff. And you're just going to want to keep this checked because, again, as it needs it, it's going to get it. This is more of, again, a server issue. So peer-to-peer means machines are sharing assets with each other, sort of like a BitTorrent. And then only from server means if you have a local server set up, then it's only going to draw from that as opposed to also from other machines. You're going to want to keep this checked unless you have a really particular reason not to. And then finally, path. And this is just where the stuff is stored. So potentially if you have a network drive or a larger hard drive that you want to keep the stuff on, or a faster hard drive, you could redirect where the repository is, so where you're keeping all the temporary files that they send back and forth between each machine. So now we know what all of our settings are. How do we actually get these machines to work and talk to each other? So this is something that had me really confused when I was trying to set up a Team Renderer. I kept launching Cinema 4D on both machines, and they wouldn't see each other no matter what I did. And I'd come here and I could see the name and the port and all this, and I'd share, and they wouldn't see each other. That's because you don't actually want Cinema 4D running on both machines. You want Cinema 4D running on your main machine, and on your second machine, you're going to go to your install folder. So that's going to be, for me, this PC, local disk C, program files, Max on Cinema 4D 2023. And for you, it's going to be whatever, wherever you have whatever version of Cinema 4D installed. And then from there, you're going to find your Team Render client. And that's what you're going to be wanting to run on every machine that isn't your main machine. So I'm running this on our main machine, but it's the same process, don't worry, for your secondary machine. So you're going to launch Team Render, and then what you're going to get is a bit of a console deal. And you're going to look at this and be like, oh, I'm not signed up for coding, but don't worry, you don't have to do any. It's going to show you your network. It's going to show you your local machine and the node. So local machine is this guy, right? And then Alec PC, you can see here, is now connected. You don't want to run this on the same machine, right? You want to run this on a secondary machine, but so I can keep all this in one spot, we're going to run it all locally. So you have your name of your PC, your port, and then you have your IP address. And you're going to want to take that IP address, and that's how you're going to connect. So you want to keep note of all of your IP address and your port. The other thing you're going to want to keep a note of is if you go over here to preferences, on the very, very far side, there's a tab. That's going to take you to a very familiar preferences window. Leave all this stuff alone for now. You have your plugins, you have other stuff. But what you want to do is go down to your renderer and go to Team Renderer. And under Team Renderer, you're going to have your security token here as well. Mine's 12345. And this is going to let you connect to your machine and actually get renders going. So you need to make note of the name of your PC, your security token, your port, and your IP address. You're also, of course, going to want to make sure you have all the sharing settings checked. The same thing happens here. You still have your threads and everything else that you can control on your client. So from here, go back to your main machine. And so what you're going to want to do is click on Machines, Add Machine, and you're going to put in that IP address and or the host name plus port. The IP address seems to work best for me. So once you put in your IP address, which again is right here, you can then put in your security token. And again, that's under Render, Team Render, and it's going to be right here. So you're going to put in whatever your security token is, and then you should be able to go. They should see each other, and it should pretty much work like magic. So now that you've put in the IP address and security token from the second machine to connect from your first machine, what you're going to want to do is test a few things. So one thing you can do is ping, and you can do a connection test. You can do the connection test to make sure you're connecting through an Ethernet cable and not through your wireless connection. And you can see here that it has high speeds, and that's good. It will say that it's low speed if you're connected over the Wi-Fi and tell you that it's probably not going to be good for rendering. The other thing you can do is ping to check about the response time. You can see here that it's pretty fast, and that's exactly what we want. So now we have both machines seeing each other and ready to render. Let's go. Well, not so fast. There are a few more little things you might want to do. So you're going to typically want to make sure that plugins on one machine are also installed on the other. So this for me means like Xparticles and Grayscale Gorilla plugins. However, the other thing you're going to want to make sure is you've cached any simulations. So if you're running any sort of physics sims or rope sims or cloth sims, or you have, particles running around with Xparticles or liquid simulation, you're going to have to cache those. There's plenty of ways to look up how to cache, and it should be pretty straightforward. But once you cache those, that will lock them into place, and that will make it far more reliable. If you don't cache, each machine is going to calculate the physics differently, and you're going to start getting all sorts of weird errors. So make sure you're caching everything. You can also bake your textures, bake your animations. I'd recommend locking down as many things as possible before going to team render. So now that you have everything locked, we're ready to render. And in order to do that, you're going to have to click and hold on your little render button and then go down to Team Render to Picture Viewer. Alternatively, you can click on your Render tab and then go down to Team Render to Picture Viewer. From there, you can also use the shortcut Control-Shift-R. As soon as I click on that, it's going to set up this render. And what we're going to see here is each machine is being assigned its own render. So I've sent them to each machine and it's rendered out. And it was really, really fast. However, you're going to notice some weirdness going on. And I've noticed on the forums, a lot of people seem to get this wrong. And I want to tell you, if you're not noticing a speed increase, you're probably running into this error. So you notice what happened is each of these frames was sent to each machine differently, and they're split up evenly, 2 to 1 and 2 to the other. This one took a really long time, and that's because it was the first frame on the second machine. So it had to send over all the data, all the information, all the project files, all got sent, and then it started rendering. But once it got all the information, you'll notice the second frame jumped way up in speed and rendered in 3 seconds. On our local machine, the first frame took 4 seconds, and the second frame took 1 second. And so what you'll notice, though, is our render time was 30 seconds. And that seems like a really long time. That's longer than any of these frames took. How did we take 30 seconds to render when the longest frame only took 20 seconds? And the answer is because the way it adds it all up. I was also confused about this total render time. So I rendered out a scene overnight that took 3 hours on my 3090 Ti. Then I did that same render on both machines, and it said it also took 3 hours. And I was really confused because I thought, well, I'm using double the power almost, right? I'm using a 2 3080s and a 3090. Surely this should have rendered a much faster. And the answer is it actually did. It rendered in half the time. But when reporting the render time, Cinema 4D simply adds up all the frames. So while my render time was actually more around 20 seconds, it's adding together all the frames and then saying it's a total of 30 between both machines. What this means is if both machines are rendering about the same speed, and it says it takes 3 hours, it's probably actually only taken an hour and a half. And it's just combining the total time of all frames. That's what this number is. It's not a stopwatch that starts and then is stopped when the render ends. It's simply adding up all the frames that you rendered in this one render job. So you're going to have to measure by your frames per machine, not by the total render time, to actually notice the speed increase. The other thing you can do is simply time your render. So start a stopwatch, let it run for an hour on one machine, and then connect your second machine, start that stopwatch and let it run for an hour, and then see how many more frames you've actually gotten out in that hour. I've been noticing this on the forums. A lot of people seem to be reporting that there's no speed increase, but there probably is a speed increase. You just haven't noticed it because it's being reported in this total frames sort of way and not total render time. I know that's confusing, but hopefully this helps you understand that you actually are getting a speed increase, but it might not look like you are. If you're running into connection or network issues, I can't really help out with that. That's going to be something unique to your network. But a few general tips I can give is make sure everything's being allowed through your firewall and make sure your antivirus isn't stopping any of the programs. Running your team render program on your render node as an administrator will probably also help, as well as running Cinema 4D as an administrator. Those are the most common issues. But anything beyond that, you're going to have to be troubleshooting yourself online, unfortunately. This video is really technical, and I typically like to talk more about the ideas and concepts behind our art and not necessarily the technical tools used to create our art. That being said, our industry is a technical industry. So I'm going to be jumping back and forth probably more often between technical and theory. If that sounds interesting to you, I would highly recommend checking out our latest theory video on coming up with ideas. We're developing a short film at Royals and Rogues, and I'm taking you, the audience, along for the journey. I highly recommend checking those videos out as well, because it's going to be a really cool process, and it takes everything we're learning here about the technical side and puts it into a practical application, which I think is going to be really valuable for you if you're a creative, a 3D artist, or someone just looking to get into digital filmmaking. If you found this video helpful, please hit like and subscribe. It really, really helps my motivation in making these videos. And leave a comment if this helps your render speeds and it helps you understand how Team Render works. Also, if you have any questions, I'll try to do my best to answer them as well in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and until the next one, break the rules, speak the truth, and have fun.